Good afternoon. On behalf of the Urban Institute, welcome to the Giving Innovation Summit. I am Tanae Traylor, incoming Vice President of the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy. Before we begin, I'll share a few housekeeping items. The first, this event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterward. You can hide captions or adjust settings with the live transcript button. Speaker biographies are available online at urban.org. All participants are muted. Type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time. We'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end of each panel to answer some of those questions. Please complete the survey at the end of this event. We want to hear from you. And lastly, please engage with us online at #live@urban. All right, we're going to get started. Again, I am Tanae Traylor, incoming Vice President of the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy here at Urban, where one of our key research areas is charitable giving. I am looking forward to joining the Urban family and the CNP team at this exciting time for our work on nonprofits and philanthropy. We're looking at big picture issues, exploring questions like what are the supports and services that the social sector needs to thrive? How well does our ecosystem accomplish this goal? And are we continuing to provide critical giving and nonprofit data and analysis to the field? Earlier this year, we brought on a new director of our National Center on Charitable Statistics to renew this important data resource for our field. And just a few months ago, we launched an online giving dashboard that collects and organizes data to provide a snapshot on the many ways Americans give. Today, we are pleased to host the Giving Innovation Summit. This is our 5th summit, a regular in-person or virtual convening that spotlights and explores trends in giving with our past events being focused on policy innovations, the democratization of philanthropy, the state of workplace giving, and the norms and narratives that shape charity and philanthropy. This year's summit is focused on concerns surrounding a decline in charitable participation rates. We will look into the evidence behind such a decline, explore its potential causes, and ask whether it is more properly understood as a rechanneling of giving away from 501c3 charities to other outlets and media. Recent data from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy's Philanthropy Panel Study continues to show a decline in the percent of U.S. households that make charitable contributions. In 2018, just under half of households made a charitable contribution. This is down from 66% in 2000. It's an important topic, and we are grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support for this event. I'm excited to begin my work at CNP, since for much of my career, I've been working in spaces where it's been clear how important charitable giving is to our missions and to civil society more generally. Not just in terms of how much money is raised or for a good cause, but the act of giving itself and making sure that as many people as possible in our communities feel respected and empowered as meaningful contributors to change. I began my professional career at a United Way and have seen the power of individual contributions. I've also helped families understand how their support can transform another's family's lives while at the Community Foundation. And I've had the opportunity to work alongside Black donors to better understand what motivates our collective giving patterns and why. So if there's reason to believe that fewer people are giving, that are actually giving, then we need to take this very seriously. But another thing I've learned in my experience in the sector is that giving can take many, many forms. And so we need to make sure that when we talk about a potential decline in giving rates, we are also being open to that variety. Today, this Giving Summit will try to do precisely that. Take the prospect of a decline in our charitable participation seriously, but also ask what we really mean when we talk about charitable giving in terms of rising or falling rates. We'll do so this afternoon with 3 panel discussions. The first one, titled Why Giving Matters, will provide framing for this entire summit. The second panel, titled Exploring the Decline in Charitable Giving, will explore research into the potential causes for decline in certain forms of charitable participation. The final panel, titled Has There Been a Decline or a Rechanneling of Giving, will examine whether there is a decline or if the decline is more properly understood as a redirection of giving into other forms. I am now pleased to introduce my colleague, Faith Mitchell, who will be moderating our first panel. Faith is an Institute Fellow working with us at the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy and our Health Policy Center here at Urban. Faith, over to you.
Thank you, Tanae. And I want to join Tanae in welcoming everybody who has joined us today. As Tanae said, I'm a fellow at Urban, and I'm pleased to work with both the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy and the Health Policy Center. And I am the moderator for the Why Giving Matters panel, which is the first of the 3 of the Giving Innovation Summit. As Tanae mentioned, this first panel will provide essential framing for answering the main question of the summit, which is, are fewer people giving to charity, or are they just giving differently? So the 3 panelists you're about to hear from are field leaders who will set the stage for the whole summit. And I'm pleased to introduce them now. We are joined today by Terrence Lester. Terrence is the founder and executive director of Love Beyond Walls. He is a speaker, activist, author, and thought leader known for his nationwide campaigns that bring awareness to issues related to homelessness, poverty, and economic inequality. His organization, Love Beyond Walls, helps people experiencing homelessness and poverty rebuild their lives. Ann May Chang is here representing Candid, a nonprofit she leads that provides comprehensive data about the social sector. She also serves as a member of the Generosity Commission, a nonpartisan group of individuals from across the charitable sector focused on celebrating and supporting America's spirit of generosity as expressed through everyday giving, volunteering, and other forms of civic engagement. Asim Khwaja is director of the Center for International Development at Harvard University. He also serves as a board member of Giving Tuesday and chairs the Giving Tuesday Data Commons Advisory Committee. I want to point out that all 3 panelists are part of larger movements that are seeking to bring awareness and action to helping others. Giving Tuesday, which started a decade ago, has been pushing the field to think more expansively about how we define, measure, track, and encourage generosity. And last fall, the Generosity Commission launched a 2-year process to recommend ways that the business, nonprofit, and policy sectors can support and enable everyday giving and volunteering in order to foster a culture of individual and collective generosity in the face of the social and economic challenges our society faces today. These are just a couple of examples of the efforts underway that show what giving looks like and ensure that the spirit of generosity manifested in many forms continues and grows. So our session is going to begin with some questions that I'll ask the panelists, but we also want to hear from you. So please put your questions in the Q&A box and I'll get them and I'll present them. And if you have a specific panelist in mind with your question, just add that to the question so I can be sure to ask that person. So let's get started. And I'm going to start with Terrence. About a decade ago, you founded the nonprofit Love Beyond Walls. Can you tell us a little bit about the organization and why it was important to you to base your organization around love as a social good?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I founded the organization Love Beyond Walls, it was actually underneath a bridge in the middle of winter. My family allowed me to live as a person experiencing homelessness for over a month on the streets of Atlanta. I slept in 10-degree weather, ate out of trash cans, was put out of shelters, and went through every single experience that a person experiencing homelessness has. My intent wasn't necessarily to grow an organization. My intent was to be with people and embody presence, to be with people who are invisible, overlooked, and marginalized. And as I met people, I discovered barriers to getting identification cards, poor support services, lack of access to mental health counseling and healthcare, the struggles with a sense of self-worth, and the lack of social acceptance and even social capital. And I wanted to embody love and mobilize people to give that same love towards people without an address, addressing the issues that I discovered when using proximity as a way of embodying that love. And so in our work, we see love as presence. It is the ability to show up and be with someone while displaying compassion and empathy, to truly acknowledge a person's existence and a person's presence. It's funny, you know, in our society, there's a weird affinity towards the use of the word love. It is said that love should be unconditional, but through my ethnographic experience, that love is not readily reserved for those who live on the margins of society. There are laws that criminalize people experiencing homelessness for normal activities that everyday people perform. Therefore, in our work, we have used love to educate people about how important it is that everybody has worth, regardless of their social location, address or not. We have used our work to drive people into relationships. And within those relationships with the unhoused, we've seen the ability for us to create safe spaces for people to meet other people who may be from different social locations. And this, in essence, has created a community of mutual aid, and it has driven generosity and charitable giving. Our organization has not only been sustained through mobilizing people around this concept of love and worth of the unhoused, but it has moved people to give in unique ways and given in ways that is just not monetary. It has been through love in the form of presence that we have seen some of the greatest stories of life change emerge, because when we have qualifiers for love, it is no longer love.
Thank you very much. I'm muted. And let me turn now to Ann May. You recently joined Candid as the CEO. Could you talk about what brought you to Candid and how Candid encourages transparency to inspire trust in the social sector?
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Faith, and for this really interesting and robust conversation. It's really an honor to be part of the panel. So about a decade ago, I made a pivot in my career from the first 23 years or so I worked in the tech sector, and decided to spend the second half of my career trying to do something more meaningful, trying to make the world a better place in the public and social sector. But rather than being drawn to, what I found is that than being drawn to any one particular issue or geography, maybe because I'm an engineer at heart, I found myself really interested in finding ways to help the sector as a whole to do more good. And for those who aren't familiar with Candid, Candid was born 3 years ago through a merger of two longstanding organizations, Foundation Center and GuideStar. And with that merger, we brought together the most comprehensive sources of data on foundations and their giving, as well as nonprofits and the work they do. And so when this opportunity came up, I immediately jumped at it because I truly believe that better data, better information, and better transparency has the potential to dramatically amplify all the work we do to address societal ills. And so I'm so delighted that we've come together today to talk about this important topic of giving. And one important question I think we should ask is, what inspires people to give? And in my experience, one of the critical elements is trust. People will give and give more when they trust an organization will be good stewards of their investment, that they understand what that organization is doing to address the issue that they care about, and that they see that that organization is delivering meaningful change. And so good data, information, and insights can shed light on all of these. And Candid's mission is exactly that, to promote greater transparency across the social sector so that people can give confidently and give more.
Great, thank you. And now, Asim, you are an economist and a scholar of international development at Harvard. Could you tell us about how your work has intersected with giving?
Great. Thank you, Faith, and thank you, Terence, and for setting me up very well. Those are both sort of really inspiring words. In many ways, I want to follow up on what Anne said, which is what I've been trying to do, both in my capacity as a researcher, but now I direct a research center at Harvard, is kind of accomplish two things. One is really bring the international development kind of narrative as well, because there's lots of giving amongst the very poor as well, not just receiving. And I think it's very important to kind of bring that perspective into the conversations we have. But also the second part is what Anne said, which is really as part of a relationship, my research center at Harvard and Giving Tuesday, which I sit on the board as well, is creating a data commons. Very similar to the efforts Candid and Anne has been doing, creating this sort of source of individual level data. So really, and I would say even more disaggregated in that, at the basis of each event, at each instant of giving, create sort of a data flow, and then use that to really bolster research, which can help us both understand giving, the forms of giving, the types of giving, the various nature that giving can take, but also start seeing how giving responds in a way, as Anne said, to understand the deeper motivations of giving. Anne raised a really powerful idea that trust in organizations can be a giver. But what are the other factors? How stable are these factors? Do these factors aggregate over time? Do these factors peter off over time? If there's an event which evokes a strong sense of giving for us, when we see that event again, do we get muted? Do we get desensitized to this? So there's some sort of really deep questions. And I think the intent is, again, similar to a lot of what we've been saying, which is create information in this space. So all actors in this space, whether you're a large organization or a small individual, Terence, someone standing underneath a bridge or sleeping underneath a bridge who decides to give to someone, whether it be that act or a large organization's act, we're able to understand that act and hopefully inspire and encourage others to follow similar acts. Very much in this kind of movement of generosity that Giving Tuesday represents. We're hoping by making these insights available more broadly, and also allowing and empowering analysts, not just us researchers, but anyone to kind of be able to navigate research this space on their own, really promote a world of giving. Thank you.
What I'm going to do now is drill down a little bit more on this question of tracking giving that the speakers have already introduced to some extent. And Asim, I'm going to start with you again. Can you tell us how giving can be an important measure of civic participation in society?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I'm in the business of, as a development economist, of measuring trackers of development, and whether we stick to like conventional measures by national income accounts or wealth or GDP. Increasingly, as you allude, we're realizing that, look, when you define success, because that's what these measures often do, they take a nation or they take a community and they define a metric of success for them. That's a very important responsibility. But when you define success or a metric of what we would hope to achieve in the world in a narrow way, you end up dismissing and sometimes discouraging lots of deep forms of success. And to me, civic participation is one version of that. And within civic participation, I think giving is just a really, really powerful element of that. And the reason I think it's important is, when we talk about, again, I do things like measuring poverty, and you obsess about people living below $1 a day or $2 a day. I think when you do that, there's a certain disrespect that you give to the poor when you do that, which is you make it look like the only way you could ever become something more than focusing on your own existence is by moving above $2 a day or something. And I think that's extremely disempowering to people. You know, I've met lots of poor people in my life. I have similar stories to Terence's stories. I've yet to meet someone who doesn't have the same aspirations as I do. But also, I feel like we should be providing tools and measurement techniques in a way that we recognize and empower things are already doing, which may even be beyond us. In many ways, these individuals who are below some arbitrary line we've drawn may actually be much bigger givers than we are. In fact, in a relative sense, they absolutely are. But sometimes in an absolute sense, if you count their time, in an absolute sense, they may be even bigger givers than we are. And I think measuring that, recognizing that, bring that into accounting will create what I hope will be a relationship of equality, right? I always believe that you can't help someone if your intent is that I'm the only person offering help. You can only help people if you feel like you're open to being helped yourself. And I think this idea of measuring generosity in the way I'm hoping we will start to do in a much more comprehensive way will actually start leveling the playing field a bit, and in fact may even reveal our own poverties as we sit in our privileged positions.
That's a wonderful, very thought-provoking position. Thank you for that. Want to remind the audience to think about what people are talking about and send us your questions, because we're getting very rich material. And May, on this same question of tracking giving, from where you sit at Candid, what are some potential reasons we're seeing a decline in individual giving rates, the way we currently measure them?
Yeah, thank you. That was so eloquently put, Naseem. I worked in global development for a long time and couldn't agree with you more. As Faith mentioned earlier, in addition to being CEO of Candid, I'm also a member of the Generosity Commission that was really created to understand these trends that we're talking about today that really seem quite troubling on the surface. As Tanae mentioned, between 2000 and 2016, the number of households that were giving declined from almost 2/3 to under a half. And that's a pretty dramatic decline. Of course, that's only measuring the sort of, the traditional giving to 501c3s. And so I know we're going to do a lot today to unpack why this might be and what it means. And as we do so, I think it's worth considering a key trend that the National Intelligence Council identified in their latest Global Trends report, something they call disequilibrium. And what that is a growing gap between the challenges we face globally and the ability of our existing institutions to handle them. And the reason for this is that there's a fundamental issue that our existing institutions were really designed for a very different day and age, and they are failing to keep up with changes that we're seeing today, whether that's a surge in polarization, the rapid pace of technological change, and the growing complexity and interconnectedness of the problems that we face. And so as our problems outpace our institutions, I think what happens is that trust gets eroded and people look to other ways to give. So as an example, over the past decade, also from a study from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, they found that crowdfunding has grown more than 20-fold, while traditional giving has declined. And so in order to understand these giving trends, we need to look beyond the traditional checks being written to those 501c3s and consider the full range of ways people are contributing to our society, whether it be from mutual aid networks to volunteering their time to booking empty Airbnbs in the Ukraine. These are all sort of ways that people are seeking out ways to give. So I think that urge to give is still there. And I think more research is required to understand if giving has truly gone down or it's solely been redirected. But I also don't want to be too rosy-eyed about the redirection. I think that if giving in fact remains the same, say, but more of it's being redirected to these sets of new channels, I think we also need to ask the question of those new channels, whether there's the same degree of transparency and accountability. The 501c3 status was set up as the form of charity, but with requirements such as being transparent about the money that we're receiving, how it's being spent, filing 990s and so forth. And so some of these new ways of giving may be equally valid, but currently don't necessarily have that same degree of transparency and accountability to society that were set up for the 501c3. So I think we need to look at that as we look at some of the new ways of giving that have been emerging.
Great, thank you. And turning to you, Terrence, speaking of the urge to give that Anne May mentioned, why do you think it would be a problem if the proportion of people donating to charity is in fact decreasing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Speaking from a lens of practice or pragmatism, I think charitable giving, if it was to decrease, would be problematic for three reasons. One, we have not seen a decline in people facing hardships, right? Communities are suffering. There are even more statistics show that in the coming years, homelessness will increase by 40%. So we have new cases of homelessness. There are organizations and people who are on the ground who are doing robust work to meet the needs on the front lines in communities. And if charitable giving goes down, does that hinder one's or organization's ability to show up to meet those needs in community? The second thing is community decline. Many organizations or even mutual aid groups, which we have a lot of partners, are support programming for those that they service, right? And in those programs, people build relationships. They foster those relationships. They get a sense of community and belonging. Some people are living isolated lives and rely on organizations, not just for resources, but just for community, right? And with the decrease in charitable giving, it would not only hinder or pause a program, but it also could cause a decline in the relationships for them to continue to foster. And many of us need to realize that relationships has empowerment at its basis. Many people are actually empowered from those who they are connected with. And so communal gatherings happen around programming, and community decline also can lead to the impact that an organization or a mutual aid group can actually have. The last thing is social change and tangible impact, right? When charitable giving declines, it disrupts an organization's ability to see tangible impact or the unique social change that that organization or that group is contributing to the larger fabric of social change. I mean, to see a family that was living in the car move into their own home when their children had to wear coats as blankets during the winter. If a program is disrupted, then that organization isn't able to see that type of tangible impact. And so when giving is decreasing, it increases the org's ability to see sustained suffering for those who are actually living on the margins of society.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. And I'm going to switch to our second theme, which is the challenges of tracking giving. I'm going to start with you, Terrence. Can you talk about how tracking charitable giving is different from tracking generosity or love?
Yeah. Well, if I could push back a little, I would say that charitable giving, generosity, and love are all three different types of concepts, and only one can be tracked by QuickBooks. I think we have a limited idea of what charitable giving actually is. The reality is that everyone cannot give monetarily. Some people show up to teach. Some people can show up and cook. Some people can show up and offer skills that might advance the work of social change, that might benefit or directly impact a life, someone who is human. And when we place charitable giving in a box, we alienate a group of people who can be empowered by giving them an opportunity to show up, to contribute in a way that is generous. Generosity could be in the form of presence, as described above or earlier. And that might be in the form of time and talent. And at our organization, of course, we track traditional charitable giving because we are 501c3, but we have established a culture that humanizes the stories of those who are overlooked in a way that builds empathy, creates community, and centers the voices of those who are overlooked and marginalized in society. And by humanizing those stories, we're able to not track love, but track how people choose to show up and be proximate in community. This is not necessarily tracking love, but it's displaying why love is needed. It equips us to say love got that person off the street. Love provided job skills. Love got that person in access to a shower. Love walked with that child in elementary school who had no clothes because they're experiencing homelessness. Love did that. And so when we are able to tell those stories in a very humanizing way, not only do we honor the persons who have the courage to suffer through impoverishment, but we get to display love that mobilizes people. And so our work is grounded in the idea that we can never meet the full needs of people that we've never met. It's centered in relationships. And so when we mobilize people to be present with love, we get a chance to see how all three impacts persons' lives.
Thank you. It's a perfect segue to awesome. My question for you is, can we think of forces like love and generosity in society increasing or decreasing?
Glad I get the easy questions. Look, it's the honest answer is I don't know. But let me give you a framework in which one can start thinking and making progress. And I think part of the fun of this conversation is there's a lot of stuff we don't quite understand in a conceptual, theoretical way, and which then eventually leads to measurement and stuff like that. And so let me give an analogy and to think about this. So one way you can think about concepts like love and generosity is like a potential or a reservoir. Imagine you have a big reservoir of water, and it's latent. We don't know, it's untapped. I didn't want to use oil because I prefer reservoirs of water right now. But imagine you have this untapped aquifer. And then the question is, what we see as manifested is the flow of that water, right? And so you might look at the flow and you might be able to measure in flow, and let's say the flow is going up or the flow is going down. In this case, it could be a charitable act, it could be a financial act, or as Terence said, an act of giving one's time, which honestly, as I grow older, I feel like that's the most precious commodity I ever had, and I'm shocked it took me so long to realize that. But you can think of these flows as something we can measure. Now, the question is, if we see a flow go up or down, what does that say about the more interesting object, which is the reservoir? Is it saying the reservoir is unchanged? Or is this one of those funny reservoirs that actually is affected by flows it sees in other sides? And the hope we have, and this is a hope because I don't think we've been able to test these concepts very clearly, is that these reservoirs grow or shrink by observing flows of other nearby reservoirs, right? Now, I think we can measure these things. I think there are ways in my discipline where you can model these objects, the huge flaws in doing so, the huge shortcomings in doing so. But I think there are ways you can begin to model these objects. But for that, coming back to the earlier conversation, Faith, and what Anne may have raised as well, is we need really detailed data. These are hard, abstract concepts to kind of to map out. My hope is really there is this may be a naive hope that all of us have this amazing reservoir that is just waiting to be tapped. For many of us, somehow that spigot hasn't quite opened up as much as it could. And what we're trying to do in this act as you create a movement is encourage each other to kind of just open the tap and not be afraid that you're going to run dry. This may be one of those magical reservoirs which keeps refilling itself. The more it flows, actually. I feel like there are very few objects. Education is one of them. Or data is the other one, which is the more you use it, the better it gets. Mm-hmm. My view of this flow is that the more you use this, I think the better it hopefully will get.
Thank you. And turning to you, Anne May, and speaking of data, given how important trust is to giving, how do we inspire it? And can data play a role in that?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a recent report from the independent sector on trust in civil society. And in that report, they found that first they found that trust overall is gradually on a decline, which is pretty disheartening. But one thing I found particularly interesting is that they found that neutral trusters in civil society, so these are people who neither already strongly trust this with civil society or are strongly distrustful of civil society. So think of them as the swing voters, if you will. So the swing voters, when it comes to trust in civil society, the things that they said they wanted to see in order to build more trust were more information, greater transparency, and demonstrable results. Like basically, they just wanted to know more, get more data in order to be able to create more trust. And so the good news is that that's very much possible. And at Candid, our GuideStar and Foundation Center platforms were designed essentially for this, that we offer an easy, standard, and visible way to do all of these. So the Candid profile enables nonprofits to share, this more information that people are looking for. And that includes details on their programs and their results, the goals of the nonprofit and their strategy, the organizational demographics, so we can get a better sense of if an organization really reflects the communities that it's aiming to serve, as well as leadership practices. And so in effect, we have this place where nonprofits can tell their own story and be found in a way that's much richer than what you get out of 990s, which is pretty sterile and pretty limited and also pretty out of date by the time the IRS releases them. And so what we found is that this is particularly valuable for those smaller nonprofits, a lot of which have been traditionally disadvantaged because they may not have the resources to do the traditional things you do to get your story out there, which is build an elaborate website, run a traditional marketing campaign, and so forth to promote their work. And so here, there's a place that they can all go to tell their story in a way that they can be found by anyone. I think of it sometimes like a LinkedIn for nonprofits, right? That every nonprofit has a page. They can really tell their story, get the information out there, and people who are looking to fund nonprofits can then find that all in one place. So I think better data is just going to allow all of us to make better decisions with confidence and ensure that more money goes to the places where it can do the most good.
Great, thank you. And I have one last, this is like lightning round, concluding thoughts on giving measures. Let me see, I'm going to start with Terrence again, I guess, go around in the same order. So Terrence, why or how do these giving measurements matter?
Yeah, Faith, I think my answer is short and sweet. Is honestly, I believe it matters because people matter. Giving is a tool to meet people where they are and mobilize other people to show up with presence. I think sometimes we forget that there are real stories on the other side of giving. It's a family right now sleeping in a car. It's a child right now that will go to bed hungry. It's a person right now that needs access to trauma counseling for no fault of their own. And I think when we humanize stories on the other side of giving, we understand how important the measurements are.
Thank you. Asim, question is why or how do these giving measurements matter?
I guess for me, two main ways. One is to recognize giving across the world, across peoples. The second is to use insights from that to encourage giving. I think that's it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Anne-May.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we need to understand what's happening in order to do something about it. Like, we need to know, is this merely a shift in how people give, or is it a true decline in generosity? Because we do something different about those. And we need to understand the ramifications. So I'll just give one example. Recent research by the Generosity Commission has shown that declines are disproportionately impacting smaller organizations. So in 2020, 42% of small organizations saw a decline in donations, whereas 29% of large organizations did. And so that's like important data for understand like what's actually happening here. And without good data, we're going to be blind to both where the existing gaps are and where the troubling trends are, let alone be able to take decisive action to address them. And so the result could be that in this case, maybe already under-resourced organizations, BIPOC-led organizations, are getting left further behind. and that we're left vastly unprepared as a society to tackle the increasingly complex challenges that we face. And so I think we absolutely do need more data, more research to help understand and tease apart the nuances, because a top line number of 501c donations has declined really masks a lot of detail and nuance about how that really impacts different organizations, different issues, and kind of where that's going.
Thank you. I am now going to turn to some questions from our audience. And the first one, it's not directed to anybody in particular, so I'd say anybody who wants to answer, feel free. The person said, I think you make good points about accountability in non-formal giving. Are there also equity concerns in some or all of these spaces? I know that certain groups like mutual aid can enhance equity, but I'm hoping to hear panelists' thoughts on accountability and equity a bit more, perhaps especially as they apply to crowdfunding. So anybody can take that.
Maybe I can respond in one way and then I'm happy to. No, I think it's a great question. Thank you. Terrence alluded to this, and I think Anne May said this as well. You can't have accountability without measurement and tracking. And one of the things I've seen, I was involved in relief in the earthquake in Pakistan in 2005. And there's a sense in charity which we faced, which is because we are being charitable, somehow you shouldn't measure us. Like the act of measurement at the time charity is being given is insulting in some way, is like inhuman in some way. And as a data scientist, that's something I encounter a fair bit. And I would argue the opposite. I worked with organizations which were very successful, but they had really poor records of what they were doing. And what is much more dangerous is, think of an event like an earthquake. Everyone's panicking, everyone's in trouble. So when you go, the world isn't a flat plane. So imagine if you have relief which you're providing, and you think that by just dotting this world, this landscape, everyone will be equally receiving relief. That just doesn't happen. There are troughs and valleys in this world. There are people with access and people with no access. And to expect the people, and they're all suffering, they've all suffered some massive catastrophe. To expect the people who are slightly better off to have that ability to say, no, don't give me those 500 packets of food. I only need 200, the 300, can you track up this 4-hour climb? There's a community there which needs support. That's incredibly hard. I think the onus is on us, the giver, to not only track the amount. We talked a lot about tracking in terms of who's giving or when are they giving or how are they giving, but the physical location and the identity of who you give to becomes part of that equation as well, right? And so when I say tracking, I really mean the identity of the recipient. What are you giving, the form of giving, and the identity of the recipient as well, the giver and the recipient. Unless we can track that, I think this world is highly unequal. And it's even more unequal when the tragedy is massive. That's the sad part. When the event is more catastrophic, we become even more unequal in how we give relief. Look, the vaccine distribution is case in point. I'm still living in parts of the world where lots of people don't have their first dose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was really powerful, Asim. In the last few years, there was this big wake-up call around equity when it comes to philanthropy and beyond. At Candid, we're really focused on the more traditional giving towards 501c3s, and so I can more speak to that space. And what we saw is that there was this surge of interest in understanding the demographics of the organizations, nonprofits that people were donating money to. And unfortunately, what happened is that all these funders started going out and fielding surveys to nonprofits with different questions, different slices, different categories, and asking for demographic information. And so it became this wild west. And if anything, what happened was that that further encumbers those those smaller BIPOC-led nonprofits because they didn't have the resources to field all these surveys and try to figure out how to respond to all of them. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is really provide a platform where we can collect all that demographic information as part of the Candid profile. We've worked with some leading organizations like Change Philanthropy and Equity in the Center to define that demographic survey. We're going to be updating again this year. And the intent is to come up with a way to collect demographic information about nonprofits, not only the CEO, but also the board members, the senior staff, and so forth. So we get a picture of what the nonprofit is really, what the makeup of a nonprofit is, and really see how well they reflect the communities that they're aiming to serve, which is, I think, a really important measure of how well that they are embedded in those communities, how to trust those communities and understand those communities. And so, in order, I think everyone's going around talking about equity, but without the data, it's impossible to really take real action there, right? You need to understand both where things stand today, where are the gaps, where are the problems, what are the groups that are being left behind, and then you need to be able to identify the groups that are being left behind and be able to focus more attention there. And so we're really trying to create the data platform and make that data openly and publicly available so that all organizations can have the visibility to understand where they stand as well as make better decisions.
I had one point to follow up, Anne May. I think even in this conversation that we can't leave out the tool and the power of social media and how that contributes to charitable giving. Case in point, there are organizations that are BIPOC-led that have leveraged the power of social media to crowdfund and pull people together digitally in a mutual way to resource projects, to provide relief for direct impact in communities that are suffering. For instance, our organization in the height of COVID launched a campaign called Love Sinks In, where we started placing hand washing stations in the streets for people to be able to wash their hands when the news was saying, wash your hands, but there weren't any hand washing stations for people experiencing homelessness. We took a small campaign with 5 hand washing stations and grew it to 72 cities around the country, where tens of thousands of people were having access to hand washing, who were literally living on the streets, right, to be able to protect themselves. And we started with social media. And so social media is a disruptor in the space of charitable giving, and we have to acknowledge its power and the ability to be able to tap into it to quickly mobilize people to respond to relief issues. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm trying to figure out if we have time for one more question. We're supposed to end in like 2 minutes. And you'll be pleased to know that Laura behind the scenes said we have a ton of questions. So that means you guys, it's been successful. It's very thought-provoking. So let me ask one last question really quickly. Someone said, I love the idea of expanding beyond the dry data in the Form 990. I'd be curious how to reach and elevate the stories of hyper-local grassroots organizations, some of which don't have the resources to regularly update their data or expand their profiles on sites like Candid. It feels like larger nonprofits continue to have the advantage. So this will be the last set of comments before we end the panel.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one since he mentioned Candid. So I actually think what we're trying to do with the profiles is level the playing field. The larger nonprofits absolutely have enormous advantages on multiple fronts. But I think the larger nonprofits also have whole departments to like field funder requests, to create websites and all that kind of stuff. And so the fact that you can have a profile that's already well designed and you could just add a paragraph to describe your organization, add some bullets to describe your programs and so forth, we're hoping really levels the playing field. We're also offering a lot of training and resources to help those smaller nonprofits really build the capacity that they need to be able to do this. I think what happens is where we've seen the smaller nonprofits be particularly disadvantaged is when there's lots of requester data. You have to fill out 100 different grant applications, 100 different surveys about demographic data. Those small organizations can't handle it. So we hope that by having one place to share your data in a way that is streamlined, in a way that anybody can find it and access it and use it, that it actually gives more exposure to those smaller nonprofits with less work on their part.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Anything anyone want to share?
Faith, just as a broad response to that, I spend a lot of time doing surveys and spending countless hours designing better surveys. One of the trends we have started pushing for is, instead of generating data as an afterthought, as an after event, something happens and we then try and go measure it. That's always costly and it always suffers from recall bias. It's much better to try and have data be passively generated using the actual act itself. So for instance, in this case, imagine if you are giving money to a charity and you're using a money transfer platform. Provided you're willing to give us permission, and this is really critical, privacy is very important over here, it would be better to generate that data automatically from your act. And then what you can provide any organization which is willing to kind of sign off for your support is to say, you don't need to keep fancy accounts at your end. You're welcome to if you want to, but we could generate this data which is coming from the trigger of the actual event, synthesizes, aggregate it, anonymize it, and then give it back to you in a form that you can digest it and give it back to someone else, as Anne-May said, who may be demanding this kind of data. I think as much as we can centralize that act, in the same way that if an individual walked over and said to a bank and said, hey, I don't have a credit score, can you construct my credit score for me now? These can be passively created. I think credit histories they're not perfect, but they're an example of data being generated passively from acts of engaging in the activity that you care about. So I think that's the future and how to go in this area. There are lots of big open questions over here. Privacy is one massive one. Accuracy, reliability, coverage is another big set, but I think it's a promise.
Mm-hmm. Terrence, did you want to say anything on this? The general question had to do with whether smaller organizations are being kind of disadvantaged by some of these, platforms and so forth.
Well, I don't necessarily, I don't have a lot to say on that. I lead a fairly small organization. We're small to mid-size, and we have been fortunate to establish the types of relationships needed for sustainability. And as a nonprofit leader, I have leveraged the power of relationships to fill some of those gaps that our organization has. In terms of using a platform like Candid, I would I'm going to sign up after this event. I would love to use a platform like Candid, but also think about how could we also mobilize larger organizations to offer support to mid to smaller organizations to fill some of those gaps as well. Is there anything within Candid's system to make those types of collaborative partnerships happen?
Great. We got the go ahead for one last question. So now another quick round. And the question is, do you think the consolidation of wealth that we have seen over the last couple of decades is showing up in the data that we've been talking about, the giving data?
I think the honest answer is we don't know. And it possibly could be, right? You could imagine that as we get into the data more, that one of the explanations is that people are seeing this concentration of wealth, these multi-billionaires, kind of giving these huge gifts, and people feeling that, what they are able to do is, doesn't matter, right? And feel like they don't have the same kind of stake in society anymore. I don't know if that's the case or not. I think we need to learn more about that. It's absolutely possible. I also saw another question, just I'll jump in while I'm on this one, on other forms of giving. I think we've talked about some other forms of giving that we definitely think of as like good forms of giving, like, getting closer to people and giving more directly. But I think that some of the diversion may also be to forms of giving that we may not generate quite as much good in society, right? So I think people, there's more giving maybe to political parties as we get more in political elements as we get more polarization in the society. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's not the same as charity. I think there's more giving towards social enterprise, conscious consumerism and so forth, if people feel like they're doing good by how they're spending their money. And there's definitely good there, but is it the same or as much good as, what we're doing in, more, direct charity? So I think those are some questions that we should grapple with.
Great. Thank you. Awesome. I see your mic's on. Okay.
I think if you measure giving narrowly, just mechanically, it's going to be true. Just as a fraction of giving. But I think that's a very incomplete way of measuring giving. We're moving beyond just measuring giving in money. We're starting to build a database on measuring time. And I think when you start doing these things, what is interesting, as Anne May said, is we don't know how people will react when they see large visible givings by billionaire X or Y, whether that will dissuade them from giving or change the form that they feel is more worthwhile for them to give. We don't know the answer to that, but I don't think it's a done deal in terms of, hey, because we have financial inequality rising, that means giving inequality will be commensurately increasing as well. I don't think that's immediate at all.
Great, thanks. Terrence, last word.
I didn't have anything. I think
Okay.
they brilliantly answered the question.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank everybody for being on the panel. Special shout out to Asim, where it's 2 a.m. where he is. Thank you for joining us in the middle of the night. And I have really enjoyed this rich discussion. I have lots of questions myself that I didn't get to, and I'm sure the rest of the afternoon is going to be equally rich. I'm going to turn things over now to Ben Saskas, who is a senior research associate, my colleague in the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy. Over to you, Ben.
Well, thank you very much, Faith, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you, and thanks especially to the panelists you just heard, who just provided some incredibly thoughtful framing. So we've heard a bit about the prompt or the provocation that led us to organize this event, and that is widespread concerns about declining charitable participation rates. I want to talk a moment about the evidence for those declines before we turn things over to our next terrific panel. First, I want to note, and as a historian of philanthropy, I'm pretty much contractually obligated to do this, that anxiety over the precarious state of everyday or small-scale giving, especially in relation or in proportion to large-scale giving, is by no means new. After the heyday of mass giving at the turn of the last century in the US, it was a regular feature of discourse surrounding charitable giving. A half century ago, for instance, when the leaders of the philanthropy sector convened the Commission on Private Philanthropy and Public Needs, better known as the Filer Commission, some of the research that they commissioned highlighted what was termed declines in giving propensity. Those concerns are still with us. So what is new? Well, let's put aside just for a moment whether the trends themselves that we'll be examining are novel. What we have now is enough longitudinal data that's tracking the same variables over an extended period of time to talk about consistent trend lines of decline. And I think that increased kind of tracking is in fact new. Foremost among these data sources is the nationally representative Lilly Family School of Philanthropy's Philanthropy Panel Study. You've already heard Anne May talk about this, which is a module of the University of Michigan's Panel Study of Income Dynamics. This is the longest running longitudinal survey of US households for several decades, almost more than a half century, in fact. The Philanthropy Panel Study follows some 9,000 plus households over time and has shown declines in giving rates when it was first conducted for the year 2000, when 66% of households reported giving to charity. And here it's very important to note that when the Philanthropy Panel Study asked about giving, it is giving to charitable organizations, nonprofits, and giving more than $25 of value. So there is certain giving which is very much left out in that tracking. According to the Philanthropy Panel Study, the drop really took off after the Great Recession. And I think it's very likely we'll hear more about the connection between economic crisis and charitable giving in a bit. In 2018, the philanthropy panel study showed that for the first time in its nearly 2 decades, less than half of households reported giving to charitable organizations, 49.6% in fact. So for a while, it might have been the case that the decline in charitable participation rates was noted, but somewhat obscured by the countervailing trend of increased total aggregate charitable dollars raised. But that crossing of the 50% threshold, so that giving, at least in the ways defined by the survey, had lost its sort of majoritarian gloss, I think really made people take notice and was a kind of rang a bell of crisis. Now, other surveys tell a similar story, if not precisely the same one, using different methodologies. There are several that don't follow the same givers, but randomly select a national representative sample each year that they are conducted, like the current population survey sponsored by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Even a survey like the General Social Survey with a more open-ended definition of giving that actually shows higher rates of participation than some of the others also shows some decline over the last decade. These findings of decline are also generally backed up by data from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, an initiative of the Association of Fundraising Professionals and the Urban Institute, which over the last decade has shown for most years a net negative of donors lost versus donors gained, a trend that was definitively reversed in 2000 before reestablishing itself in 2021. And here I just want to note, and this is a point that Giving Tuesday's Woodrow Rosenbaum has pointed out, that we need to pay attention to what those local peaks can tell us, even as we focus on the more general declining slope. It's also the case that there's evidence for a decline in giving rates outside of the US, though it doesn't always map precisely onto US trends perfectly. A number of surveys in the UK, for instance, have shown evidence of the decline over the last decade. One government survey reported that in 2013-2014, 82% of respondents reported giving to charity in the last 4 weeks, whereas in 2020 and 2021, that number had dropped to 63%. There is some evidence of similar declines from Australia and Canada. And I here just want to give a shout out to the researchers and scholars at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy who've done such important work in providing an overview of these trends and statistics. So it might be the case that not all evidence points to declines in charitable giving participation in the US, but I think it's very clear that the preponderance of evidence does. And so for the purpose of this panel and the next one, we are going to take it as a given that something is going on, that there has been some sort of decline in charitable giving rates to tax-exempt charitable nonprofits that's persisted over time, and which is linked in some way to a phenomenon of more dollars, fewer donors, as it's sometimes been described. And so in this next panel, we are going to ask what might be behind that decline. We're going to hear from another 3 terrific panelists who will outline the evidence behind 3 possible explanations and help us think through what that evidence can tell us about the declining charitable participation rates, but also what it can't tell us, what the limits of the evidence might be. The first, Jonathan Muir, is the Mary Julia and George R. Jordan Jr. Professor of Public Policy at Texas A&M University, and he'll be discussing the relationship between economic prosperity and economic precarity to charitable participation. Elizabeth Lin, the project director of Shifting Ground at the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, will discuss changes in religious affiliation, identity, and observance, and how that might affect charitable participation. And Carolyn Lee, professor of sociology and faculty director at the Landis Center for Community Engagement at Lafayette College, will discuss theories of declining social capital and their relationship to charitable participation. Now, I want to just make clear that These are not, this is not a comprehensive survey of explanations. There are certainly several that we will probably leave out, and it'd be great to hear from you what those might be. And there's a whole category of analysis relating to shifting patterns of giving behavior that we'll be actually taking on more directly in the next panel. But I think these three scholars will do much to frame the general state of evidence surrounding declines in charitable participation rates. I'm confident they'll give us much to reflect on. And as we had with the first panel, there'll be time to answer audience questions at the end of the session. And if you have those questions for the panel, please type them into the Q&A box. And if possible, you can address them to particular panelists, or they can be to all three. And so without any further ado, I will turn things over to Jonathan Muir. Jonathan, the screen is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'll wait for my slides to pull up. And there we go. I have control of the slides now. So it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about the effects of the economy on charitable giving, which is a particularly important topic because the need for private philanthropy is often greatest during times of economic distress, which is just when the ability of donors to contribute is most limited. But there's a number of ways to unpack this question. So let's dive into it. So the first, that there's a correlation between how the economy is doing and whether and how much people give to charity is pretty obvious. And there's plenty of evidence on that. So this figure here, which is from a review paper about a decade ago by John List, shows a noisy but non-trivial relationship between the performance of the stock market and changes in charitable giving, at least through the start of the financial crisis. So maybe it's time for someone to update this graph. But this tells us only about one aspect of economic performance versus overall giving. Far more interesting is the relationship between an individual's income and wealth and their giving. And I'm using giving as a catch-all term for all philanthropic behavior. Here we heard some great discussion of the various aspects of giving, and I think the final panel will really focus in on that. And I've done some work on the trade-off between these different types of giving as well. But oftentimes we economists, we look for our keys under the lamppost because that's where the light is. We've got data on monetary giving, and so that's what we focus on. So we really want to know what the correlation between being well off and giving is, and more importantly, if someone's income or resources go up, are they more likely to give, and do they give more? So I've been curious about that for a really long time because there was surprisingly little evidence on that particular question. And so a few years ago, my former PhD student, Benjamin Friday, and I dug into it using that panel study of income dynamics that Ben discussed, the philanthropy panel study from the amazing folks at the Lilly School. That's a fantastic data set that's tracked the same set of people and their giving behavior every 2 years since 2000, though of course the PSID itself goes back to the late 1960s. So I could spend hours talking about this project and all the interesting things that we discovered, but the first simple thing that I want to show you is this very strong positive relationship between income and the likelihood of making any donation. So each one of these bars represents 5% of households sorted by income. And you can see that the probability of making a gift in a given year increases by 70 percentage points over the distribution of income covered in the panel study of income dynamics, which of course doesn't sample the ultra rich, but their giving rates tend to be extremely high. We did the same exercise for household wealth. This time adding 2 extra bins. All the way at the left is for people with negative wealth, and then for people who report 0 wealth, and then 20 bins dividing up positive wealth evenly. And you can see that same increasing pattern here, excepting those with negative wealth, who unsurprisingly tend to be young, well-educated, and often high-income households who hold a lot of debt, whether it's mortgage debt or more often student debt generally from professional schools. But this is a really tricky question because here we're comparing very different people at different stages of life. So what we can take away from these 2 graphs that I showed you here is that the sort of people who earn and have more money are the sort of people who are more likely to give. So without getting too deep into the econometric weeds, we look to see whether when an individual person earns more, do they give more as they move up the income distribution? So the takeaway from this upwardly sloping mass of points is that the positive relationship between income and giving is still there when we consider what happens to a person as they move up or down the income distribution. And that holds true for wealth as well. Here, this is giving compared to a comparison group of those people with negative wealth, who again tend to be unusual in the sense that they're often actually high lifetime resource people, even if the snapshot we're looking at tends to be people with low contemporaneous resources, or at least wealth. But this study, as awesome as it is, doesn't really get into trying to compare the effect of changes in the individual circumstances from changes in the overall economy. In a different project with 2 undergraduates in my research program, we looked at giving around the time of the Great Recession with an increasing set of control variables to try to explain that drop in giving. That is, how much of the observed decline in giving, which you see in panel A at the upper left-hand corner here, could we explain with things about the individual's own changing circumstances, like their own changing income or housing wealth at this time of the financial crisis and the Great Recession, and how much could we explain with changes in local economic conditions, and how much seemed to be about broader trends. And I should add that the amazing Una Osley at the Lilly School, who I think is in the audience right now, did a separate study looking at a deeper dive on which groups were most affected with this pattern, which I think is a great complement to our sort of more broad approach looking at this change in giving around this time. So I won't ask you to squint too hard at your screen, but the takeaway is that there was a sharp drop in giving around the Great Recession that can't be explained by changes in those individual circumstances or even changes in local economic conditions. And we hypothesize that changes in attitudes or my personal view, increased uncertainty was driving that relationship. So there's a strong relationship documented in other contexts between uncertainty and people's willingness to consume. Donations are to some extent a form of consumption, and they're quite a there's certainly one over which we have a lot of control, a great deal of control relative to, say, purchases of food. And so it may not be surprising that that's someplace where people cut back when they're feeling insecure or uncertain. So Fizman, Jekyll, and Kareev conducted a set of generosity experiments before and after the 2008 financial crisis and pointed to a possible explanation, which is that those exposed to the Great Recession behaved less altruistically when sharing money under different conditions in a lab. And those authors hypothesized that attitudes had changed around this time. And again, I think that notion of insecurity or uncertainty could really drive that particular possibility. So another explanation is this idea of crowding out, that donors to some extent view government spending on things they care about as a substitute for their own donations. This has deep roots in the literature on the economics of altruism, and it's particularly relevant in this discussion because government spending has increased dramatically over the last couple of decades and takes particularly big jumps during downturns. So the evidence does suggest that government spending correlates with lower giving. But my recent work with my former PhD student, Hedy Tajali, using the amazing data from donorschoose.org, shows that this relationship is driven by less fundraising by organizations that receive more money from the government, which in turn leads to less giving, rather than the donors pulling back their giving independently of the actions of the charities. Finally, what are the implications for the long run? So if giving takes a hit because of economic circumstances, we might expect lower long run giving. So my work looking at habit formation and charitable giving showed using as good as random variation in the likelihood that people gave when they were in their early to mid 20s, that getting them into the habit of giving led to much larger donations when they were in middle age. So the generation whose habits are being formed under greater uncertainty and stress may be less likely to give now and to give less in the decades to come. So on that cheerful note, thank you all very much for listening, and I'll pass the baton to Dr. Elizabeth Lin, who directs the Shifting Grounds project at the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving at IUPUI.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, I am now going to take us down a slightly different path. We're going to talk about the relationship between faith and giving, both of which here at Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, we find are on shifting ground. Starting first with what we know about changes in charitable giving, I'm going to share some data from Giving USA, and I'm grouping together changes across the 2 pandemic years. So this shows changes in charitable giving from 2019 through to the end of 2021. Charitable giving, the charitable giving pie grew. It grew by over 7%. A big part of that, foundations giving to charity, which grew significantly. Individual charitable giving also grew. Giving to religious institutions, in fact, did not grow and stayed relatively flat. And this seems like a very significant part of the puzzle that we're puzzling about today. You may have heard, as we hear about the charitable giving pie growing, that in fact, religion gets the biggest slice. You can see here, it's a very big slice of the pie. This is 2020 contributions. I mean, that's the piece of pie that you want to take at Thanksgiving, but you know you shouldn't. That was about 29% went to religion out of all charitable giving tracked by Giving USA in 2020. What's interesting, though, is that that slice of the pie has been going down consistently for many years. This, again, is Giving USA data. We've highlighted the proportion of giving to religious institutions in red, so you can see it really clearly. Starting in 1980, it was almost 60% of all charitable giving. And over the last 4 some decades, it has dropped by half to now 29%. This seems like a very significant piece of the puzzle that we are collectively puzzling. It gets more puzzling, however, when you think about the fact that Giving USA defines religious giving as giving to congregations, denominations, missionary societies, and religious media, where the focus is specifically on cultivating religion itself. Other data shows that if you ask donors what they think of as their own religious giving, they might say that it's actually even more than that 29%. This slide comes from Connected to Give, which was a study conducted by Jumpstart in 2013. I highly recommend their series of studies under the Connected to Give label. And here they asked donors themselves, what portion of your giving is religious? And donors included congregations. You can see it there as 41%, but they also included giving to religiously inspired organizations they saw as having a tie to faith and values. It might be in the title, like Catholic Charities, the Zakat Foundation, Jewish Federations, and so on. So according to these donors, their religious giving was much more encompassing. It included faith-inspired organizations, which constitute such a significant portion of the social sector. Now, if we want to puzzle a little bit about what religiosity has to do with giving, it gets even more complicated still, because we have to ask what counts as religiosity. We can look at 3 different B's here. We can look at belonging, believing, and behaving, and there are probably other B's not yet discovered. But religious affiliation, that identification with a religious tradition, is one of the easier, I think, indicators to track in figuring out if religiosity is tied to giving. And there, the data does show that there is a strong tie. This, again, is drawing on that amazing philanthropy panel study that has been mentioned many times today. It comes out of a Giving USA special report from 2017, and it shows that donors with an affiliation, with a religious affiliation, give significantly more than donors without a religious affiliation. So this is one piece of the puzzle that we need to hang on to. How do we understand this role of affiliation and participation in a specific religious tradition? and where it leaves us today with charitable giving. One of the narrative explanations is obviously that religious affiliation is falling. This shows religious affiliation by year of birth, which really tells us that this has been a story that's been going on for a while. This is from Scientific American and shows that, if you look back at 1900 as the year of birth, you can see some sloping decline there in religious affiliation among Protestants. And you begin to see the rise of the nuns after about 1930, and in right around 2000, they cross each other. So clearly declining religious affiliation may have something to do with declining charitable giving. But affiliation takes place in the context of participation in association. I think that's something we heard a lot about in the first panel, in relationship to one another and in community. So here I want to take us to a story that I find quite helpful in understanding what might be happening with giving to religion and to other organizations. This comes from Dwight Sheely, who teaches at Luther Seminary. And it's called From the Age of Association to the Age of Authenticity. He's clearly drawing on the work of Robert Putnam and others in making this argument, but he ties it particularly to the lives of congregations. Sheely points out that the vast majority of congregations in America were birthed in and designed for the age of association. And you can see here confirmation classes and choirs and families joining in congregational life in that age of association. These associations are sustained by voluntary membership, by giving and participation. And all of that makes less and less sense, as he points out, in what he calls the age of authenticity. What is that age of authenticity? It's one in which people seem to feel less and less of a need to affiliate with an organization to find meaning, community, and purpose, and understand their search instead as a highly personalized journey. Now, this is very significant because it shows up in all generations, but we certainly see it showing up among young people. Springtide Research Institute has done some very interesting research on young people's meaning making, religiosity, and sense of belonging. And I want to just draw your attention here to what they've found, which is that nearly 3 in 4 young people actually identify themselves as religious, if not affiliated. And yet they don't see their faith communities as places to turn in times of uncertainty. Jonathan was talking about uncertainty as a context that can affect giving. Well, here we see, even among young people who identify as religious, a discomfort with turning to their own associations, their own faith communities in those moments of uncertainty. Among young people who are affiliated, more than half have little to no trust, another term in today's conversation, in organized religion. So affiliation is part of the picture, but it isn't all of it. There is a stronger story here that I think we've been talking about today of how much we trust associations and institutions, and how perhaps in moments of uncertainty, those are not organizations that we're going to be turning to. Well, then we have to ask, are they going to be the organizations we are going to be giving to? And are they organizations we're going to be signing up for? This, as I often say, is a sign-up sheet circulated in a congregation after it's been circulated these days. There are significant declines in the percentage of people volunteering and giving within congregations. I think that leaves us with 2 questions for further research, along with, I'm sure, many, many more that you all will be asking. One is, what does religious giving look like in the age of authenticity? I mean, we really want to think about those young people who call themselves religious. How do they understand their faith and values calling them into giving? And then the second question is, what happens to associations themselves that have been designed around pledging membership and voluntarism in this age of authenticity? So at this point, I am going to turn this over to my colleague on this panel, Caroline Lee. And Caroline is a professor of sociology and faculty director of the Landis Center for Community Engagement at Lafayette College. Caroline.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think, I hope this will tie in well to what you were just talking about. I'm so glad to be on this panel, and I'm going to start talking about declining social capital and the evidence for that, and then a bit about how that relates to charitable giving. And I'll start with bowling alone. This, of course, was Putnam's intervention with an article in 1995, and then a book in 2000. And it really resonated with huge variety of popular audiences that social capital had declined over the 20th century. And you can see that the paradox, despite this sort of concern about social capital decline, and interest in that topic increased over the last 20 years, or since the article in 1995. So what is social capital? We've been talking around this for both panels, and this is a sort of synthetic concept that encompasses social networks. So informal networks you have, those are with your family or your close friends, that typically referred to as bonding ties. Networks that you might have from formal associations, your church or Rotary, and those might be cross-class or cross-social groups, and those we would call bridging ties. And then this more generalized concept of trust. So why are those important? Social capital matters because at the individual and community level, social resources create more social wealth. So if you think about the capital piece of this explanation, that those social ties are resources that can be leveraged to create more social wealth, more generous behavior, solve collective action problems. And so here you can see that on the left-hand side of the table with trust and social ties are all stars all the way across. You've got positive associations with volunteering, with charitable giving, and with informal helping behaviors, which we've also been talking about. Okay. So has social capital really declined? Of course, this started Putnam's book started a lot of conversations about the evidence for this. And at the level of, quantitative variables, the research does find declines in generalized trust. Okay. It also finds declines, much less of a decline in terms of people's informal ties, but substantial declines in organizational memberships, the sorts that Elizabeth was just talking about. And that, Theda Skocpol has described this sort of shifting world of nonprofits from these tiered membership organizations where people learn to participate and associate with each other to national level mail-a-check organizations. And this is really a period and not a cohort effect. So it's not just that the greatest generation, died, but that in general, everyone, moved away from these associations. So these are both correlated with rising economic inequality, but these kind of explanations, or at least fights over what, the actual decline of social capital on particular variables, doesn't really get at the texture or the quality or the intensity of those ties and how they've changed over time. So, Skocpol notes that in this decline of membership organizations, associational life had, and I think Elizabeth did such a great job of pointing this out, had intense meaning and significance for people. People were listing their memberships on their tombstones. And if you imagine your own memberships today, you probably would not list them on your tombstone. So what is the effect of social capital on charitable giving? The evidence shows that social capital is strongly associated with charitable giving. and that it really makes sense to think of people's giving as connected to their communities of participation. So, you know, to think beyond this kind of individual level behavior and to think at the community level of the density and the mix of opportunities and obligations. And within these kinds of communities of participation, you know, religious commitment and participation has a very strong influence on giving behavior, you know, as Elizabeth pointed out. So what is the mechanism? Like we can say that social capital is associated with giving, and you know the causation goes the other way, right? The more that you give, and it speaks to what Jonathan was saying, the more that you give, you know, the more you're in the practice of that, the stronger your relationships might get, the more networked you are, the more you sit at the table at the fundraiser, et cetera. That you know there's an additive effect here, or at least a circular effect. But social capital is an important influence because it increases people's information about opportunities, and it also increases their motivation for these activities. And I would argue that this mechanism is very powerful, but I'd also argue that it's been leveraged. And remember when we were talking about social capital in terms of wealth or resources being used to create more resources, that I want you to think about a number of actors who have also learned to leverage these social networks for wealth. So you can think about multi-level marketing, you can think about political campaigning and the ways in which social media is used in political campaigns now, that there's been a lot of success in all different kinds of activities that we might call civic. We might actually start framing, and here's where my research comes in. I look at how the kind of palette of civic behaviors has increased, has broadened, and also at how it's professionally sponsored or facilitated or subsidized by a broader range of actors than we used to think. So it's certainly businesses, et cetera. So I'm just going to end by highlighting some social trends that I think are affecting these contexts, and certainly the decline of social capital leading to declines in giving. So one is these changes through new technologies in all different aspects, all different properties of social ties. You think about these sort of thinning of ties, but also an intense, more distant ties, et cetera, through social media. Increasing instrumentalization of ties and an increasing expectation of ties being instrumentalized. So, just those sort of routine calls for birthday fundraisers on Instagram or Facebook. Proliferating invitations for short-term engagement or participation from all different types of organizations. So join the conversation, join the discussion, come visit our website, buy the t-shirt, et cetera. And that along with those invitations comes a kind of celebration of pro-social behaviors that are very individualized, that we might think of as being somewhat shallow. So things like boycotting, just buying a product of a socially responsible company, or contributing to a campaign. And I think all of these trends point to a redefinition of obligations and a kind of routinization of tie-based giving. So, we see, people start getting used to and maybe having some fatigue about these kinds of, GoFundMes, et cetera, this is all a sort of context that breeds norms, et cetera, about when to give and what to give and what's kind of a normal thing to ask. And you also see this sort of formalization of the informal realm of these kinds of mutual assistance. So those would be trends that I would point to start our discussion, and I will leave it there. And back to Ben.
Great, thank you all so much. Terrific provocations there. We have a couple of terrific questions. The first one was directed to Jonathan, but I actually think it's appropriate for all of you to address. And that's 2020 was a time of much uncertainty, including related to the economy, and increased government spending. What do you think offset those pressures to decrease giving to ultimately increase giving, especially by everyday donors? So we can expand this to all panelists. How does 2020 and kind of the pandemic years fit into these trends, do you think? And we'll start with you, Jonathan, but then everyone else feel free to weigh in.
Like with pretty much everything else about the pandemic, who knows? I don't know that we can extrapolate all that much from our previous knowledge about something that was once in a century kind of event. I think it's interesting that the point that the really excellent question from Victoria in the audience is that so much of the government spending during that time was checks to individuals. I think the technical term, a completely insane amount of money was sent out the door. And so for many people, their other disposable spending was almost completely cut off. No one was going to restaurants, no one was traveling. And so not to take us too far down that route, but a lot of households, by no means all, but a lot of households came out of the initial shock in far better financial circumstances than they went into it. And so that extra disposable money, when you look at the combination of the marginal propensity to donate out of that additional money, and Ben Marks in the audience has some great work on windfall donations. If you view those checks from the government as a windfall, for some people they were, then that combination plus the obvious and very in-your-face demand and need, I think combined to lead to much higher levels of giving, which I think is some of what we saw. So I'll stop there because I'm sure Elizabeth and Caroline have different and probably better perspectives on the question.
Either of you two want to weigh in? Okay. Well, another question. This is warms my heart as a historian. Many of the social trends discussed, religion, trust, social capital, have shown declines for many decades, but the decline in traditional charitable giving appears to be far more recent and sudden. We've heard, it took a sudden hit after the Great Recession. How should we think about the relationship given this fact? And anyone can take that on.
I confess to being the humanist in the sociological sandwich here. I'm not myself as grounded in the social science data, but I do wonder just about the cumulative impact of disaffiliation, declining association, and civic engagement, and how that may just kind of snowball. One of the studies I didn't mention in my presentation, but I think is particularly helpful to look at is American Generosity, Who Gives and Why by Patricia Herzog and Heather Price. And they talk about 4 kinds of givers. And they're looking at generosity in a broad way, not just giving of money, but I think this holds for giving of money as well. And they talk about the sort of spectrum from impulsive giving, which we've heard a lot about today, the sort of episodic giving, as Caroline put it, to planned giving and thoughtful giving, and the sort of formation of thoughtful givers who both think through their giving and plan it out over time. And those givers tend to give more than the impulsive givers. And that kind of formation of thoughtful givers requires a certain social context. So I just would love to see more research on how the changes in that context in formation may account for a kind of more of a snowballing of charitable giving decline.
Jonathan or Caroline, you want to weigh in?
I hesitate weigh in on these questions because I'm not an expert on charitable giving. I will say that one thing that came out of the pandemic is certainly people spending more of their time online and having more of these social relationships online, and these sort of thinner sorts of connections. And just tying back to what Elizabeth was saying about the sort of desire for authenticity, for what types of experiences would lead to this more sort of intensive type of giving, or that there really is this hunger for those kinds of deeper experiences in community, or at least I'm thinking of mission trips, these kinds of doing a deep mission trip for a week at the border or something like that. That sort of, those deeper connections may have been less possible during the pandemic, would be my sense. But as I say, I hesitate.
I want to ask one very quick question, and I'll turn it over to our terrific third panel. And this one actually anticipates that next panel, and that is, given these really interesting relationships between certain trends in charitable giving that all three of you have outlined, does anything in your narrative change, or do you find it challenging in any respect if you expand the definition of giving considerably to include non 501c3 giving, but many other sorts of giving, crowdfunding, person-to-person giving? Would that radically alter the way that you look at the question, or even the questions that you ask? And let's quick answers to this, and then we'll turn over to panel three.
I'll hop in. I have a handbook chapter with Laura G. at Tufts that looks at the altruism budget, and a big part of it is just how hard it is to measure the things that we're not measuring. Informal giving, volunteering, and then make it even more complicated over time. If people shift from bequest giving to inter vivos giving, the total amount that they give over the course of their lifetime may not change, but the way we measure it changes quite a bit. Donor advised funds are a big part of that in terms of changing the way people structure their giving. So it's complicated, and read our chapter. It's good.
Okay, well, we can end on that note of kind of acknowledgement of complexity. You guys all, I think, rose to that challenge. So again, thank you all, to the three of you. I'm now going to turn over things to my colleague at the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy, Laura Tomasco, who will bring us into the third and final panel. Laura, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, Jonathan, Elizabeth, and Caroline, for that great discussion on the evidence behind possible explanations for the decline in charitable giving participation rates. And I really appreciate that last great transition question. So as Ben said, my name is Laura Tomasco, and I'm a policy program manager at the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy at Urban. And I will be moderating this final panel where we will ask the question, has there been a decline or a rechanneling of giving? And this question really gets at the heart of what we're exploring during today's Giving Innovation Summit. I am joined by a terrific group of scholars and field leaders who will explore this question with us. First, we have Taisha Maddox, who is an assistant professor at Fordham University. Second, we have Alex Guerrier, the Chief Executive Officer of Donors Choose. And finally, Tyrone McKinley-Friedman, who is an associate professor of philanthropic studies at Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And as with the other panels, we will have time to answer audience questions at the end of the session. So if you have a question for the panel, please type it into the Q&A box. And as Ben mentioned in our last session, we have been seeing a decline in charitable giving participation rates to tax-exempt charitable nonprofits, and this decline has persisted over time. And so what we want to talk about in this session is the shifting patterns of giving behavior. So if giving participation rates to charitable organizations is what we are measuring, how do we account for other forms of giving? How should we think about measuring and understanding the full scope of generosity of Americans? As the Generosity Commission sets out to celebrate and support America's spirit of generosity, they talk about how the spirit is expressed through everyday giving, through volunteering and other forms of civic engagement, while recognizing that giving and volunteering go beyond giving to C3 organizations. And this more expansive definition of giving has been explored by organizations like Giving Tuesday and by scholars like Lucy Bernholtz. 5 years ago, the Urban Institute Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy published an On Track to Greater Giving poster. This poster displayed a variety of giving channels, such as workplace giving, collaborative giving, and political giving, showing how giving through these channels, some of which go to charitable organizations and some of which don't, fluctuates over time. And this spring, we have updated and expanded this poster to launch an online giving dashboard. In this giving dashboard, we collect and organize data from studies across the field to provide a snapshot of the many ways that Americans give. We define giving expansively to include not only donations to tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, but also crowdfunding, impact investing, and more. We will be updating this dashboard on a regular basis to show the ways in which giving behaviors are shifting over time. And on that note of shifting giving behaviors, let's bring in our panel to talk about expanded notions of giving and whether we are seeing a decline or a rechanneling of giving and what that means. So I'm first going to ask a question to Tyrone. So Tyrone, you study the history of African-American philanthropy, and in your latest book, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow, you write about how the importance of giving within the Black church and more informal networks of giving. How has your research and scholarship informed your perspective on the question of whether there has been a decline or a rechanneling of giving?
Well, thank you very much, Laura. I'm very happy to be a part of this panel. So my own scholarship would lead me to start by challenging the question a little bit, particularly around this idea of rechanneling. And I would say that, you know, the channels have existed outside the traditional 501c3 nonprofit infrastructure. They've long existed, and that they've been vital parts of everyday life in many different communities, especially the ones that I study, communities of color, African American philanthropy in particular. But because these pathways or channels don't always align with tax policies, tax definitions that count gifts, you know, they don't get counted when we conduct this kind of research. And so I want to share an example that'll come from my own personal experience, but reflects some of these things that I see in the scholarship. So one, you know, I'm the son, grandson, nephew, and cousin of Black Baptist preachers and first ladies. And so having grown up in the church, one of the ways that I served or volunteered, though would have never ever used that language, was to be an usher. And so in the process of collecting, you know, taking up the collection every Sunday, there were always two offerings every Sunday. The first one was always for tithes, right? This notion of giving a certain percentage of one's income. And so as we would pass the plates, some people would put in envelopes that the church had given them that had a unique identifying number, so that the gifts that they put in there would be tracked on a ledger. Then they'd get a letter, and they could then go make their charitable deduction claims. But as an usher who's holding these baskets, I noticed that there were just as much loose cash as there were envelopes. So there were many people who weren't tracking it in that fashion. The other offerings would depend upon the Sunday. So there was a Poor Saints offering, and this is where the collection would then go to local nonprofits that the board of trustees would give to, who are addressing social issues, hunger and insecurity and other kinds of things. Here again, same thing. Some people might write their number in the check memo, but most are just throwing in cash. So it's not getting captured. You know, another might be the foreign missions collection, where money is given to international networks that were building schools or supporting orphanages or responding to earthquakes in other countries. Again, not being tracked in a similar way. And then one particular, scholarships, that the church had a commitment to supporting young people and going to schools. So we take up collection, provide scholarships. But again, many times people would not note these gifts in any particular way. And I remember recently having gone back home to my home church, speaking with the deacon who has chaired that scholarship committee for many different years. While we were talking and catching up, the number of people who kind of interrupted us just to press some money into her hand and say, use this for the kids, use this for the scholarship fund. It happened so much that it really was kind of, Keisha had to say something about it. It was just kind of like, I'm sorry we're being interrupted this way, but it speaks to this kind of direct person-to-person transfers, that's not always captured. But if you fast forward now to our post-COVID world, where many congregations have adapted digital tools to facilitate giving, what's interesting now is that with this intermediary who's recording these transactions, now there's the option. You can note if this is for your tithes, for the scholarship, for the poor saints, which might be new, but the channel was already there. Right. So I would say that, these platforms may be attracting new givers, but the channels already existed and they may be being facilitated in a new way. But again, they've already existed. And there's also a caveat there, because there's also congregations, even as they have adopted these tools, many of them are still receiving significant amount of their revenue through the mail, because some of the members are not comfortable with these platforms, or they may not have credit cards, or don't trust earlier Ann May brought up this idea of trust. They don't trust the ACH transfers or other types of ways in which these transactions are conducted. So I would say that these channels have long existed, but perhaps new digital technologies are facilitating these channels in a new way, and in the process, maybe introducing or ushering some new donors who were previously unfamiliar with them into them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tyrone. Next question I'll direct to Alex. So you recently joined Donors Choose, which is an online platform that connects donors to teachers in need, as the CEO. And you previously led another online philanthropic platform, Global Giving. So could you talk a little bit about what you make of crowdfunding's role in relation to the decline in charitable participation rates that we are seeing?
Absolutely. First, I'll just thank you, Laura, for the chance to participate in this panel. First, because I see a couple of my friends among the attendees, so hi to those friends, but also mostly because I've gotten a chance to meet Tyrone and Taisha and learn from them. I am significantly outgunned when it comes to actual knowledge, but I've thoroughly enjoyed learning from the discussion, and I'm sure I'll continue to learn. One thing that I do have is, as you mentioned, I've had this incredible privilege of leading two pretty important and innovative crowdfunding platforms. And I'll just note for those who may not be familiar that both of these organizations were founded a long time ago, ages ago in internet speak, right? Donors Choose in 2000 and Global Giving in 2002. So this is before Facebook, long before smartphones, before Web 2.0. This was in the time of the first .com sort of frenzy. And, at that, so these were pioneers in crowdfunding. And at that time, they were innovations and really setting pace in giving donors. And I think this is going to build on what Tyrone was talking about, really being on the leading edge of a whole new way for donors to interact and see donation options. But we're no longer in 2000 and 2002, and expectations have changed. And those innovations, what seemed cutting edge at that time, is really just a core part of what donors expect today, right? The sort of rapidity, transparency, ease, facilitation, et cetera. It's really just a core part of what donors expect. And so part of the effect that crowdfunding has had is to actually sort of help to meet that need and establish it and even set it. Now, I'll also note that both of these organizations, Donors Choose and Global Giving, are actually 501c3s themselves. And so all of the giving that happens through us, and I'll just use us to mean both for the moment, falls under even the strictest definition of philanthropy, but it's also the case that we're in a field where the range of crowdfunding platforms doesn't just include 501c3s that are also oriented towards 501c3s, but either for-profit platforms themselves or platforms that also facilitate sort of giving to individuals, et cetera, not tax deductible. However, when we think about our if I think about our combined impact on participation, I think it's actually been pretty positive. I mean, over the last 20 years, but actually even over the last few years, both platforms have seen an incredible amount of growth. So for example, this year across both I love this. I get to brag about the two platforms that I love so dearly. But across the two platforms, just this year, we're facilitating about $350 million worth of, again, 501c3 oriented philanthropic giving just this year. And both of us are we're both having our record years, and we're both on growth trajectories. When we look at our sort of competitive set, to some extent, we are competing maybe against the GoFundMes or sort of other giving, but actually, especially when we look at our retail donors, mostly we're competing for dollars against other, forms of consumption. And I think we heard this in a prior speaker. So for example, when we sell charitable gift cards, our competitors are Starbucks gift cards and Amazon gift cards. And so the dollars that we're looking to grow are actually coming from other just forms of spending, definitely not in general other nonprofits or even necessarily the other platforms, because we occupy quite a different space. So overall, I would say that the contribution of crowdfunding, I mean, I'm a little bit biased, of course, it has been positive. Though I'll certainly note, if I just sort of take away that kind of bias, that if you look across the full range of activity that happens on crowdfunding platforms, there's going to be some that at least some of us might find sort of questionable and more fodder for today's discussion.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Alex. Now, Taisha, your current research focuses on the significance of early 20th century Anglophone Caribbean immigrant mutual aid societies and benevolent associations in New York City. During the COVID pandemic, we've seen some mutual aid societies working in partnership with 501c3 charities, and other times intentionally set themselves in opposition to C3s. So for researchers trying to get a grasp on whether there is a decline in participation or a rechanneling of participation, how does mutual aid fit into the equation?
Thank you so much for your question, Laura. And I think Tyrone brought up a very excellent point in the fact that, to push back on the question that these organizations have existed for so long. Even when we think of mutual aid organizing and the boom that we see or that we saw in 2000 in terms of participation and the number of mutual aid organizations coming about, I think the reason that they were able to mobilize so quickly in 2000 is for that exact reason, that the framework was already there. It already existed. There are already groups that were doing this work on the ground, and so that people could just join into these efforts and lend their help. So I think that is a really important point to make, that these groups have been here for a very, very long time. I study turn of the century, so 1890 to 1940 mutual aid societies that were already doing this kind of work in New York City at the time. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. I also think that we have seen people who are new to this form of giving. And so we do see a rechanneling. In many of the points that were brought up in the last panels, this idea of transparency, trust being down, and people wanting to participate in grassroots, direct impact, hyperlocal organizations. We see this in mutual aid societies. Those needs are being directly met by this kind of participation. And so we do see people taking their money and funneling into these sorts of organizations as opposed to the traditional charities for those exact reasons. So yeah, I don't want to get into everything because I know there are some other questions that will come up later in our discussion. But yes, I think twofold. One, we have always had these organizations around, so to push back on that. And then two, yes, we have seen a rechanneling in newer efforts towards mutual aid.
And I want to, for this next set of questions, pick up on a theme that I'm hearing that's really around this expanded notion of giving. And Alex, for you in the crowdfunding world, there's a similar tension in that some crowdfunding opportunities are tax deductible to C3 organizations, and some fundraise directly for individuals without the ability to receive a tax deduction. You alluded to this a little bit in your opening remarks. How do you think this fits into a narrative about an expanded notion of philanthropy and giving?
Yeah, it's a great question. I did sort of hint at this in my first answer. And of course, philanthropy, this was discussed in some of the prior presentations, like any other word, can have different definitions in different places, different contexts with different people, and also over time, I might use two examples. So actually, one I'll take away from crowdfunding, and then another I'll use a crowdfunding example. An example that I was discussing a little bit earlier with some of the other panelists is a YouTuber, Mr. Beast. Many of us may not know this YouTuber, but some of us may know this YouTuber. And actually, those of you who know this person may know that has this sort of title of the internet's largest philanthropist, or the YouTube's biggest philanthropist, which is very interesting. So what does he do? He got his start doing kind of stunt videos, giving cash to Uber drivers and other people. Is that philanthropy? Not clear. He also runs contests where people who do crazy things can win a lot of money. That's probably not philanthropy. But he's also had, he's run several campaigns. One focused on, the hashtag is actually Team Trees, and one focused on Ocean Conservancy called Team Seas, where across those two, he raised $50 million from viewers of his own contributions and from viewers of his videos to registered 501c3. So is that philanthropy? Almost certainly. But he doesn't stop there. He has a separate organization, Beast Philanthropy, which I think is quite small, but which is a registered 501c3. And also he has different business ventures, some of which sort of fund different amounts of stunts, and you can win cash, probably not philanthropy. But I guess my point is that across these different activities, I think he's untroubled by which ones fall under this, specific definition, or he's untroubled by which one. And in fact, they play into each other, and they're part of his growth strategy and his strategy to reach his audience. I also think about Impact Guru, which is a crowdfunding platform, friends and a platform that I really respect. Started off in India, is ostensibly focused on NGOs and charities in India, but over time came to see that most of the activity on their site was geared towards individuals funding unpayable medical expenses for other individuals. So very much in the tradition of some of the other traditions that my fellow panelists have brought up. And so they pivoted. And by the way, Impact Guru is a for-profit charity. And so, as I think about these examples, and also some of ours, I think they're instructive. And I think that one, you mentioned the word tension between those. I think it calls into the question whether there's a tension. Is there a tension across 501c3 oriented activity and not? Probably depends on who you are. If you're Mr. Beast, there's no tension. These two play into each other, into a strategy for reaching an audience. They're sort of part of the same story. If you're a donor, probably for some of you, it may be completely invisible. If you're a 501c3, is it a tension? Maybe or maybe not. It's a tension if this tax status is an important part of your value proposition and how you seek to communicate your value to donors. That's probably under threat. So I think that there's a question about whether there's a tension. And in any case, I think these stories do fit into a narrative of just continual change and expansion in what philanthropy is and how people want to give.
Thank you, Alex. Really appreciate those examples and that thoughtful response. Taisha, what would you say the recent rise in interest in mutual aid suggests about how people are thinking about where to turn for help and how to think about their own giving? So what does this suggest about how we define and measure giving levels?
Thank you. I think the recent rechanneling, right, of the way in which people are showing their generosity and giving, it calls to attention how we analyze giving and what we think of as giving and generosity. And I think there's really a call for us to be more expansive and open-minded in our own definitions. I sat in a meeting at my own university and we discussed giving back to, I teach at Fordham University in the Bronx, and we discussed ways in which we could talk about giving back to the Bronx community and how we could get involved with local grassroots groups. And one of the deans in our meeting, because I asked, well, does every group have to be a 501(c) in order to participate? Because I think there are lots of groups that are valuable and could be very impactful to our Fordham community, and we could in turn be also helpful to them. And he immediately was like, oh, well, why don't they have a 501(c)? And so I think that's a very limited way for us to think about impact and giving and generosity. And I think there are many limitations to the 501(c) as to why some of these smaller, more hyper-local or grassroots groups do not have 501(c) status. And so I think we need to be more expansive in our definitions of what generosity and giving is. I think what was brought up in the previous panel, in the first panel, was also very important to think about giving and generosity, not in terms of monetary donations, because I have tons of friends who donate their time, who donate their skills. They're web creators, and so have sat and created websites for a lot of these smaller mutual aid societies who previously did not have websites, which has also helped expand their groups because now people can search for them online. And I think that is really an important way that people are giving their time, their talent, not just monetarily. So I think we need to be more expansive in how we think about giving, and how we define giving and how we measure the terms of giving. I don't know exactly how we can measure those kinds of things, but I think that conversation needs to start. And I think, for instance, Giving Tuesday and their data commons have done an excellent job in rethinking the ways in which we give and what giving means to many communities.
Absolutely, Taisha, I agree. It is challenging. There's no easy answer, and appreciate you kind of continuing on that theme of expansiveness. And I'm gonna push that over to Tyrone now. So in your work, Tyrone, you have pushed for a more expansive understanding of who counts as a philanthropist and what counts as charitable giving. How do we need to rethink these definitions, especially when it comes to the type of person-to-person giving and informal networks of care that you spoke about in your introduction?
Yeah, well, I think it's important for us to ask, on whose terms, right, are we setting these definitions? Whose definitions are we using? And so this kind of perspective taking, I think, is very important. So what if there are communities and cultures of giving that have a different set of expectations or practices or understanding surrounding giving that don't align very nicely with tax policy, which guides much of the research that we do in the field. And so I think that's a critical question for us to ask ourselves as researchers and trying to get at this. And just a recent example that kind of reflects some of these tensions around definitions that we see in interviews and research. A conversation I had with a very high net worth African-American couple, and this has shown up in many interviews that I've done. But this couple has a foundation, a very high public profile in their community, giving to many different things, highly sought after. And one of the things they said to me is that, people see the foundation and they think that's it, but they don't see the niece that we bought a car for. They don't see the nieces and nephews we're putting through college. They don't see that family member who we're helping with rent, right? And so they don't see all of that, but all of that is the same to us. And so this is very, very interesting, right? If we think about this notion, to whom do I have responsibilities, and how am I giving, and what does that look like? It's very important, right? Because tax policy is making some distinctions, right? If you pay your own kids' college tuition, the government says that's not a charitable deduction. If you pay somebody else's kids college tuition, right, as through a 501c scholarship, it is, right, because the government needs some distance between the giver and the recipient. But here's a community and culture of giving saying that distance doesn't matter, right? That kind of giving and receiving is part and parcel of the same. And so they don't view that as being necessary. And so that taking care of the family is important. Taking care of extended family is important. So all of these things will count. And we see this in communities of color in particular. And so, in the example I shared, here's a family saying, yes, it does count, whether or not the government thinks it does. My resources are finite, though I may have more than most. They're still finite, and I'm thinking about these things collectively. So I think it's important to keep those kinds of perspectives in mind. And when we're thinking these definitions, to keep in mind that not everyone has this kind of capitalist orientation towards philanthropy that's based on the notion of the surplus. That for some, there's this communal notion of giving from one's substance, right? And bringing your total self, right, into the process of helping others, and all the different types of gifts. I love the way Terrence earlier talked about love, right? And so that's important. I think there's also, there are communities and cultures of giving that, again, don't make distinctions between givers and recipients. This notion that they're one and the same. I am because you are because I am, right? That no one is too close or too far that for a gift to be made, blood, friends, or strangers. That's important. Also, communities and cultures that also, to the point that I think Alex was making earlier about these tensions, that they don't distinguish between the spheres or sectors in taking action, a public sector, a private sector, a nonprofit sector. When you look at the history of communities of color, these communities know that these sectors have been both friends and foes, right? And their history has taught them that these sectors will eventually turn on you. You have to develop your own. You develop your own channels. You support your own communities. You develop your own institutions. And so, again, it's a notion of all hands on deck. And so don't have the luxury of thinking about what I might do with my surplus in a foundation and what I might do over here. Say, no, it's all hands on deck, because freedom and liberation requires us to keep trying many different things. And then also there are many different non-monetary ways of giving, which I think was important, that there are many different ways to alleviate pain, to press for social change. And we've heard many people on this panel and the others talk about those different ways of giving. So I think these are some important things to keep in mind when thinking about what these definitions could be, should be. But I think it's important to look at it from the perspective of the people who are doing the giving. And unfortunately, communities of color have often been overlooked and not even considered in the various equations that we bring to studying these questions.
Tyrone, and thank you all of you I really appreciate all the very specific examples you guys provided in your responses. I think that helps kind of paint a picture of what it means to really be expansive in your notion of giving. And I'm going to ask one more question of the panelists, and would just encourage people to continue typing your questions into the Q&A, and then we'll be happy to share those with the panelists. So as you all have discussed, person-to-person giving has existed, and it will continue to exist alongside giving to C3 organizations. So given these forms of giving often occur outside of the universe of C3 charities, how do you think we should approach the question of whether or not fewer people are giving to charity? Let's first hear from Taisha, and then Alex, and then we'll finish off with Tyrone, and then we'll move to audience questions.
Yeah, so I think going back to the point I was making earlier, this idea that we have to broaden this question and broaden our ideas of I'm sorry, I'm tongue-tied. Broaden our ideas of what we think of as giving is very important to this. I think for many reasons, including, I think, when we overlook certain communities, then we tend to, or we overlook certain communities and put them into a box, then we start to formulate negative ideas like these communities are not as generous or not as giving in terms of their their charity, but I think we know that to be the exact opposite. Many of the points that Tyrone brought up, I can even think of in my own Caribbean family. They don't consider themselves as giving to charity, and yet they do the work of charity, sending money back to local communities, sending goods, clothes, barrels of technology, like old technology or even new technology, back to these local communities. And that in itself is something that is considered giving, right? But there aren't forms for them to fill out to record that kind of giving. And so I think when we don't look at these kinds of communities that give in these ways, then we overlook them and we take away their agency in many ways as active participants in this universe of giving. And so I think we just need to be more expansive in how we define giving and the ways in which we measure this kind of giving.
Laura, shall I go next? And I think this will build on what Taisha was saying, but I think about this question about how to approach the definitions or the boundaries between giving or whether these dollars are being rechanneled as an operator. And so therefore, I think about it as a competitive question and as an innovation question. I mean, here at Donors Choose, I know and I deeply understand the impact that we're having on the classroom. And so our goal is to maximize that impact. And so if there are other innovative examples, like the YouTuber that I mentioned, et cetera, I mean, a little bit it's competitive. So there's a competitive sort of energy there, but also, it's on us and it's on me to try to figure out, well, is this illustrate a way that we can reach additional donors or build our donor base or build new areas of support? And that actually feels exciting. So I think that is also the tradition that Global Giving has had, and certainly what we have at Donors Choose, which is to try to draw inspiration from these other channels, especially knowing, and has been pointed out by my fellow panelists, that sometimes it's not new channels, but rather just newly revealed to some segments of the population channels that have already been there.
Thank you. And so I would only add, approach the question cautiously and with care, and pay attention to culture. I think that's very important. The cultures that inform people's giving affects what they think they're doing, what they're trying to do, how they do it, and again, which may not be captured in the typical definitions that we're using. I think it's also important to pay attention to language. Again, Taisha just kind of hinted at this idea that people are engaging in behaviors, but may not use the accepted terms in the field. And so an example I can share is that a friend of mine was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and we eventually started talking about giving circles. And he said that he wasn't familiar with giving circles. He's from Grenada. And as I began explaining to him what, giving circles were per his question, he started smiling and said, "Man, you're talking about running the box." And I said, "Well, what do you mean running the box?" He said, "That's what we do in Grenada. When we want to help somebody, or somebody's trying to deal with illness or go to school or recover from something, we will pass the box around and go around and collect this money and collect resources and then deliver it to that person. So y'all just running the box, right?" So he actually did know something about this, even though the giving circle term didn't mean anything to him, right? So I think there's many different examples like that. That's important to really understand people on their own terms and perspectives that inform what they bring to this kind of giving. And so I'm just saying, just ask ourselves if we're seeing these forms of giving and these practices through the lenses of the people and communities who created them and are practicing them, or are we seeing them through some other lens?
Thank you. Really, really appreciate all of those reflections. I'm going to move right to our audience questions. We've gotten several wonderful ones. First question, has the pandemic changed personal definitions of charitable? So during the shutdown, there were many examples of local hair salons and small coffee shops who use crowdfunding to keep their doors open. But these aren't nonprofits. but are part of the local community fabric. How significant do you think these changes might be, if they are in fact changes? Open to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And actually, one of the projects that I'm proudest of from Global Giving, because I was at Global Giving at the time in 2000, was actually oriented very much towards this, this challenge. It was a big grant, $5 million from Sarah Blakely, founder of Spanx. And it was geared towards women entrepreneurs. So women entrepreneurs who had small businesses. There were certain criteria. And actually, we worked at Global Giving to find and reach and support these entrepreneurs, most of whom, not all, but most of whom had, non-tax exempt entities. And one of the thoughts that we had at the time was that actually the model that we were using there was quite linked to a model of micro grants that we were using with, registered charities or charity equivalents in other countries for our micro grant program. So how significant is it? I think it is significant. It's a way to reach new donors, sometimes in significant amounts. And it's, again, a source of learning where actually in both of these programs, we were quite deliberate about lowering the bar to access, in a time of great need.
I would just add, even before the pandemic, I think you see some of this chameleon behavior, if you will, or morphing behavior. If you think about the world of podcasts and the ways in which many podcasters will use the Patreon platform and ask their audiences to donate. Right now, it's not the same kind of transaction as if you were giving to a 501c3. You're literally paying that person's rent, their car, whatever, so that they can produce this content that you like. Right. But this language of donating, right, is out there, and this sense, and people become dedicated, supporters and patrons of podcasts and other forms of content creation. And again, so using some of the language and things that we see in the nonprofit sector, but is it different? It's something different, right? So again, I think thinking about this from the user's perspective, the giver's perspective, what do they think they're doing? What are they trying to do? Is very important in trying to parse out what's actually happening.
Yeah, I would add that I don't think people are making this distinction between their giving in these kind of like very narrow definitions. I think. So yes, I would say their idea of being charitable has expanded because I don't think they're making those direct distinctions. I think they believe that they're helping in any way they can to various organizations, people, community like stalwarts, like a bakery or a local. For instance, by my house, there is a local mailing place that's been in our neighborhood for hundreds of years. And they were recently faced with eviction. And the whole neighborhood came together to donate money so that they could pay their rising rent prices so they could stay in operation. And I don't think people were seeing their giving as something different than giving to the Red Cross. In fact, they might have seen it as more direct in terms of helping. So yeah.
Thank you all. I'm going to move to a second question, and then hopefully we'll have time for a third. So next question from the audience. I'm often struck by the generosity of recipients in sharing their stories, which contribute to our understanding of need and make a case for supporting that need. For nonprofits and causes, there's a direct advantage by this giving of stories that could be measured. Have you ever seen this measured? Has anyone seen this measured on this panel?
So going back to my very, very early examples, I studied these early mutual aid societies. And within the records of the societies, one of the ways I measured the impact of the societies in the number of thank you cards and letters within the organization's records. And there'd be tons of like cards saying, thank you for your generous gift of 40, it's 1900, so $40 to help my family sustain while I was in the hospital. Thank you for this, thank you for that. And so I measured the impact of these organizations through the thank you letters and cards and notes that were in their records, and that clearly they thought it was something that was important to record and keep, because they had them saved from these records in 1900 of all of these members thanking the society. So a very early example, yes.
We'll take examples from all time. Tyrone, do you have something to share?
Yeah, I would think about this question in terms of the notion of the gift of words. And how words can have a philanthropic currency that can uplift or empower or inspire. And so you think about mentoring and building relationships with young people and trying to, inculcate something, a different vision for themselves if they might be in a difficult circumstance. I think those things are what is how I would relate to this question. And in my own research, I'm highlighting the example of Madam C.J. Walker, a Black entrepreneur. One of the things that she would do during the height of Jim Crow, travel around to Black communities and tell her success story, not to boast that she's this wealthy person and nobody else is, but to counter the racist Jim Crow narratives about what Black life is. And she's saying that, I'm a living example that we are not what they say we are, and neither are you. And that's a very powerful ethos in the history of African Americans and the ways in which they've had to develop their own narratives to push back on what society said who they were and what their potential was. So I think there is something very powerful there that speaks to this notion of, again, words and different types of non-monetary gifts that have this philanthropic currency because of the impact and the ability to help facilitate change, even if that change is a shift in perception of oneself or one sense of possibilities.
Great. I'm going to ask our last question. So we have a question here about micro giving, about rounding up to a store or Lyft, also sometimes known as point of sale giving. And this is one way in which requests for charitable giving have been introduced into various parts of our life, including consumption at the checkout counter, for example. So what do panelists make of this form of giving and what it represents?
I'll give a first answer. I think it can be awesome. Actually, one of our partners at Donors Choose, Panda Cares, the foundation associated with Panda Express, which many of you may know, does engage in this. It's part of their spirit of inspiring giving. And one thing I'll say is that it can add up to a lot. It may be micro, but it added up to $3 million. That they were the largest private, not non-public giver for us this year. And so a huge amount of impact, and very much, again, in their giving philosophy. And I saw another sort of version of this question in the chat, that it may not involve as much thinking, about the giving, which may be true, although, different people are different. We have some donors on Donors Choose who literally love, actually many, who literally love to comb through projects and read the different projects and connect with the one, and they will spend hours. I mean, we can see it in the data, spend hours on the site cumulatively, just combing through, reading about the impact, etc. And then they give a lot. That is awesome. And then we have some who are inspired at point of checkout at Panda Express and give, and guess what? That's awesome and adds up to a lot. And then there are some who find out after the fact, after they bought a limeade at Sonic, that they have contributed through that purchase, or maybe they, and that's also great. And so, I think I'm not inclined to privilege one modality over another, especially because it's not even person to person. I mean, even as one individual, you may engage in different modalities of giving and different levels of sort of interaction and intentionality. But I can promise you that each one of those dollars is having an amazing impact in the classroom. So that's the way that I think about it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm going to sneak in one last question before I turn it over to Ben to close us out. So given all the challenges that you all have posed to the more restricted way in which charity is measured, focused on 501c3s. Do you think we should just consider focusing less on the whole pursuit of measurement and tracking more generally as being fundamentally flawed? And if you all could give extremely concise responses here.
I can start. I would say no. I think though there are flaws in sometimes in the questions that are posed and how we track, I think there is value in having this data and having this knowledge. I think Asim brought up a really good point about knowing where we give and how we give and whom we give to. And I think without that data, we can't make those kind of decisions. So I would say that we need to rethink, revise, and resubmit. But I don't think we should do away with tracking totally. And that's also the historian in me who tracks everything.
Makes total sense. Tyrone, Alex, do you want to do a thumbs up on keeping measurement? Okay, I see. Wonderful. It sounds like there's some good caution sort of put out from this panel about why we should recognize an expanded notion of what giving is, but we should not wholesale move back from the activity of counting for a lot of the benefits that Taisha just explained there. Well, thank you so much, Tyrone, Alex, Taisha. Really appreciate you all closing out our Giving Innovation Summit. I'm going to ask Ben to come back on our virtual stage, and thank you all so much.
Well, I will be very, very brief, and I will just say Tyrone talked about the gift of words, and I just want to thank all of you, all the panelists, for those gifts that you've given us, but also the gift of presence, something that we've heard about, and just being here and sharing this event with us. There's a lot more to discuss and to puzzle over and to reflect on, and I know we'll be doing this for the foreseeable future, and we just welcome all of you to join us in that. I want to remind you that this recording will be made available on the Urban site, and I think the link will be sent to you. But once again, just thank you for all participants and whatever way you guys did participate, and we hope to see you again soon. So thank you all.